Shavua Tov and Chodesh Tov, and we're continuing our discussion about a machshava poseles of chutz luzmano, chutz l'mkomo, and pigul, and isur kares and pigul with regard to menachos. So we're now on the top paragraph of Tet Zayin, if you're following the text. Im chishe v'shas halochas hakometz v'lo v'shas halochas halavona, do we view the kometz and the levona as one entity? You know, the kometz has to be burnt on the mizbeach, and the accompanying levona has to be burnt on the mizbeach. And therefore, we have a principle of ein machshava b'chatzi matir. And if you had a machshava of chutz l'zmano, machshavas pigul, in only half of the matir, then it doesn't generate the isur kares of pigul. And now the question becomes whether or not we should apply chatzi matir in the distinction between haktoras hakometz, or in this case holochas hakometz, and holochas halavona. Nechelku amoroim bidino. Here we have a sugya in Masechta Menachos that records a machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Mention before we go on that sugya in Menachos is on Daf Yud Zayin. I suspected it, but I just want to double check. Rabbi Yochanan says, Yesh b'shirayim chiyuv kares. And that means that the principle of ein pigul lechatzi matir does not apply in this case. And therefore, his machshava at the time of holochas kometz of chutz l'zmano would engender in the shirayim a status of pigul with an isur kares. And this situation where he's got a holacha of the kometz and a holacha of the levona, that's not called a chatzi matir. Shekein holacha eino avoda hamateres. The concept of ein pigul chatzi matir only applies to an avoda hamateres. But holacha is not a holacha, is not an avoda hamateres. It doesn't engender or trigger off any sort of a heter. And halacha that there's no pigul b'chatzi matir is limited to a case of an avoda hamateres, not applicable according to Rabbi Yochanan to halacha. And again, this will have implications as far as all zvachim are concerned. Reish Lakish disagrees. Holachas kometz o levona b'fnei atzmon hikak Torah echad mehem b'fnei atzmon the ein bo chiyuv kares. Reish Lakish accepts an equation between holacha and haktorah. There's a mirror image, and the same regulations that govern haktorah govern holacha as well. And just like in the case of haktorah, then we see that holacha. In the case of haktorah, there's a haktoras echad mehem b'fnei atzmo. What does that mean? Let's read it one more time. Holachas kometz o levona b'fnei atzmon hi kaktoras echad mehem b'fnei atzmon the ein bo chiv kares. Again, the language is a little bit heavy here, ambiguous, but it means that we integrate both the holochas kometz and the holochas levona into one avoda, and it's similar to haktorah of both the kometz and the levona. And we said that if he has a machshavas pigul in one of the two, whether it be in the haktorah of the kometz alone or the haktorah of the levona alone, then we apply the principle of ein pigul chatzi matir. We're going to do the same exact thing in the case of holacha. And this, despite the fact that halacha cannot be classified as an avoda hamateres. And Reish Lakish is rejecting the shita of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan insists that halacha is not an avoda hamateres. The principle of chatzi matir is inapplicable, doesn't apply to the case of halacha. But Reish Lakish says no. Halacha is one of the four avodos. And in this case, the halacha integrates both the kometz and the levona. And if you only add a machshavas chutzos mano in one of those two, in the halacha of, let's say, kometz, but not at the time of the halacha of the levona, then it's a situation of chatzi matir, and therefore it doesn't engender a chiyuv kares. Now we get to another case. What happens if he has a machshava poseles of chutzos mano during one avod, but not for that avod, but for a future avod? In other words, we anticipate Aktoras halavona. Now he's involved in Aktoras hakometz, and he has a machshava poseles of chutzos mano during time T A for the sake of the avodah that he's going to implement at time T B. And here we have a shita of what's called Harife Pumbedisa. They were known as the sharp ones from Pumbedisa, the city in Bavel. And they say, Harei Zeh Pigul, that this engenders the chiyuv kares of Pigul. And the reason for that is because you could be machashed mi'avoda la'avoda. You can have a machshava of chutzos mano during one avoda for the next avoda. And this would be relevant, let's say, in Zvachim, if at the time of the Shechita, he has in mind that he's going to do the Zrika chutzos mano, or that the Zrika will be matir the basar tomorrow or 2 days down the line, depending upon whether it's Kodshim, Kodshim Kalan. Now the Chachamim hold ein pigul b'chatzi matir, and if that be the case, then even if I grant you that his machshava b'shas kometz, b'shas aktoras hakometz, could be relevant to set up a machshava poseles for the shas aktoras halavonum, even so, but you have another problem over here because ein pigul b'chatzi matir, your chutzos mano machshava was only as far as aktoras halavonum. That's only a chatzi matir. Meaning, to be matir the shirayim, we need both haktoras hakometz and haktoras halavon as well. The two integrate to form one indivisible matir for the shirayim. It says, "After das chacham asom she'ein pigul b'chatzi matir ein ze elo kishechishev b'kometz o b'levona al achilas shirayim." So when do we apply the principle of ein pigul chatzi matir? That's only when he had this machshava either during kometz or during levona vis-a-vis the achilas hashirayim, that he's going to eat the shirayim chutz l'zmano. Avol machshava b'kometz al halevona he kimachshava shel matir kula. Really a fascinating chiddush here. Very subtle point. And he's saying that when A plus B, which means kometz plus levona, are going to impact and generate a heter on C, C meaning the shirayim, then you talk about ein pigul chatzi matir. But if you're operating inside the bounds of the kometz or the levona themselves, forget about their impact on C, on the shirayim, and he has a machshava of chutzos mano on the levona. Again, he only had that machshava at the time of la Torah HaKometz, but we're holding now that yesh machshava mi avoda lavoda. And in such a case, it's not considered chatzi matir. Let's go over it one more time. Aval machshava bekometz al halavona, he kimachshava b'matir kulo, because now he is isolating the levona and he has a machshava on the levona. When he's establishing that the shirayim will be in chutzim komo, then we have to integrate both the komets and the levona into one entity. And then as one joint matir, we're going to apply the principle, if he had a machshava chutzim mano on one of the two, of ein pigul lechatzi mat. That's only vis-a-vis a machshava of chutzim mano on the shirayim. But if we're talking about a machshava of chutzim mano on the levona itself, that's considered a matir sholim, and therefore it engenders the Isur Kares of Pigul. Das Rav Chizda, same Rav, aims at Pigul. Rav Chizda, the name of Rav, says this would not qualify as Pigul. Ve'afil das Rabbi Meir asover sheyesh Pigul b'chatzi matir. V'shum shakometz eino matir salavona. Upigul hu rak b'machshava b'matir al hanita. Let's say, for example, you need shchita in order to set up a zrika, so that shchita becomes a matir and zrika becomes a nita. Therefore, if you had a machshava poselis of chutzis mano at the time of the shchita, vis-a-vis the zrika, I'm going to do the zrika tomorrow, that genders a pigul on the nita, because you have a matir and a nita. But in the case of komets and levona, there's no relationship between the two of matir and nitar. And therefore, since the komets is not the matir levona, and pigul only applies at a time of the machshavas of the matir on the nitar, like we spoke about the shirayim, you need a matir for the shirayim. But here the komets is not matir the levona. The levona stands on its own 2 feet as a separate independent entity. But in chishek b'shas haktoras hakomets lahaktir es halevona v'lechol es hashirayim chutzis mano l'divrei hakol harehu pigul mishum sheposhta machshavto b'chol. The fact that he had a machshav chutzis mano at the time of the komets for the levona, that doesn't automatically protect you against pigul. If he has a double machshav, in addition to having a machshav chutzis mano on the levona, he also had a machshav chutzis mano on the shirayim, then that remains a machshava poselis that generates an Isur Kares and pigul unto itself. The fact that he also had in mind that the levona should be burnt on the mizbeach chutzis mano, that's irrelevant, because that could not generate pigul per se, because as we said before, it's not a matir and a nita. But certainly vis-a-vis the shirayim, we have the matir of komets, and his machshav at the time of the matir of komets was that the nitar, the shirayim, should be eaten chutzis mano. That's enough to generate pigul and an Isur Kares. Pigul b'shirayim ha'asurim be'achil. We've always been assuming in all our scenarios that as a result of the komets and the levona, you can eat the shirayim, and therefore, if you had a machshava poselis at the time of lamazog and the komets for the shirayim chutzis mano, then there's pigul between the matir and the nita. But what happens if the shirayim cannot be a nita? Let's say the shirayim were taken chutz la'zorim, or let's say the shirayim were tamim. Is on that we have a machlokes tanun. Shirayim shenifsalu biyotze. The case is where they took the shirayim outside of the azara and the apostle. Rabbi Akiva holds his pigul here. Because keep in mind, Rabbi, so we've said a million times that pigul only applies when, if not for its machshavas pigul, everything went perfectly well. The kashrus, kedas, ukidin. But here you already have a psul yotze in the shirayim. And yet, Rabbi Akiva holds there's a psul and an Isur pigul that's generated by his machshava at the time of the comments for the shirayim of chutzes mana. What do you mean chutzes mana? You're talking about a machshava posels on the matir vis-a-vis the nitar. There is no nitar over here. The shirayim are also b'achila by virtue of the fact that they were possible biyotze, and yet Rabbi Akiva holds that the machshava of chutzes mana at the time of the comments is kovea echiv kares on the shirayim of Pigul, even though the shirayim are also b'achila because of yotze. Intuitively, we understand and identify with the Shita Rabbi Eliezer, the dissenting view against Rabbi Akiva, who holds ein kares. There is no kares in the case of shirayim shekvar nifsalu biyotze because they don't have the status of a nitar, and Pigul only applies from a matir vis-a-vis a nitar. He has a machshav at the time of the avodas matir that the nitar should be eaten chutz l'zmano. There is no possibility for the nitar to be eaten at all, even bismano, because it's possibly the yotze. Rabbi Akiva is a pella. Rabbi Eliezer is much more intuitive. However, we have now a shita of Rabbi Yochanan in interpreting Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Yochanan says that we misunderstood Rabbi Akiva. He's not talking about a case where the entire shirayim were brought chutz and were possibly din yotze, but rather mikta shirayim were taken chutz and were disqualified midin yotze. So yotze miktsasam, then Rabbi Akiva says, since there is still a segment, a representation of the shirayim that did not go chutz lazara, and it wasn't possibly din yotze, is yesh b'hem chiv kares al pigul. Now, Rabosai, again, I'm going to add my own 2 cents, and I could be way off the market, but I would assume that Rabbi Akiva is talking about a case where what was left from the shirayim that wasn't yotze and still remained kosher was at least a kezayis' worth of the shirayim. L'das Rabasi, afilu b'yotze kulo. Rabbi Akiva went as far as to say that even if there's nothing left to the shirayim that was not possible towards yotze, nevertheless he can still engender an isur pigul and a chiyuv kares. And the reason for Rav Asi's very extreme presentation of Rabbi Akiva, which seems to reflect the simple, straightforward words and the translations of the words of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva didn't make any stipulations. That was only yotza miktsas shirayim. Is because I think, according to Rav Asi, what Rabbi Akiva is saying is that you can pile up pigul on top of a psul, meaning that pigul doesn't have to engender a new isur and a new psul. Again, all the avodos have to be avodos ksheros, but as far as the heft of the karma, if it was taken yotze, I can superimpose upon yotze a psul of pigul. And the reason for that is because pigul is an isur kares. Yotze is not an isur kares. Again, you're not allowed to eat the basam, that's for sure. In this case of the mincha, you're not allowed to consume the mincha. But nevertheless, there's no isur kares. Now you want to superimpose on these shirayim a chiv kares of pigul. Rabbi Akiva says you can. And again, just on the side, it reminds me very much of what's called an isur mosif, that even though we usually apply and activate the principle of ein isur chal isur, but if the second isur is mosif, it expands the first isur, or it's more chomer than the first isur, then we will apply isur chal al isur. But here, pigul chal al psul yotze, because pigul is an isur kares. Now we get to the case of chisru. Chisru means that at some point part of the Shirayim were lost. And Rabbi Yochanan's opinion is that we will be maktir the komets even on behalf of Shirayim shechasru. You did the kmitza, you're ready to be maktir the komets and be maktir the Shirayim. But what happened is, before you got a chance to be maktir the komets, the Shirayim became chassid. Right? Let's say the minimum shir was Isaron, and half of it got lost. Says Rabbi Yochanan, Maktirin Ktores Aleir, even though again, once it's chaser, it's aser b'achila. But nevertheless, you'll be maktir the komets. And we always understood that Haktoras HaKomets is coming as a matir for the Shirayim. In this case, there is no matir of Shirayim, because after the Kmitza, part of the Shirayim got lost. L'das Rav Huna v'Rava einav nikboim bepigul afil l'shitas Rabbi Akiva. Even though Rabbi Akiva holds that if the Shirayim were passel b'yotzei, you could still passel them as pigul. You could be kover pigul with the nisakares. According to this approach, Rav Huna Rava, there's no pigul even according to Rabbi Akiva. Now let's understand, what's the difference between a case of Yotzei, where Rabbi Akiva holds that now you could be kover pigul with the machshav v'chutzos manu, even though it was already nifsal b'din Yotzei, and the case of chaser, where you're missing part of the Shirayim. So the Gemara says the following. This is Sugya Menachos on Daf Yud Beis. Bishum shechisaron hu shinu beguf hamincha. In the case of Yotzei, nothing changed in the mincha. It's exactly identical, whether it's here, whether it's there, inside the Azara, outside the Azara. Mashen came here in Chaser, you change the guf of the Shirayim. It no longer has the shir. And in such a case, not only did the Shirayim become prohibited because it's Chaser, but in addition, a machshava of chutzos mano could engender a chiyuv kares. Just 1 second, did I say that right? No. I meant to say, sorry. Even according to Rabbi Akiva, who recognizes being kovea, generating a chiyuv kares of pigul on top of yotzei, that's only because yotzei is not a psul begufo. The gufa mincha is identical, whether it's inside or outside. Mashen can hear that it's chaser, and we have now a psul and an isra achila begufo, then we cannot add on top a chiyuv pigul. That's Abaye. So all that was Rav Huna and Rava. Hadavar nishar b'saf. B'toche toli v'machlokas hatanoim ba'amura. So it's very possible that according to Abaye, we're left with a machlokas hatanoim, like we had before in the case of Yotzei. Rabbi Akiva says there's a machshava chutzos mano at the time of Haktoras HaKomets vis-a-vis Shirayim that were Yotzei, and he would have a consistent view in a case of Chassid. And according to Abaye, Rabbi Eliezer, who disagreed with Rabbi Akiva about the machsheves chutzos mano at the time of Haktoras HaKomets vis-a-vis Shirayim of Yotzei, would say the same thing vis-a-vis Shirayim that were Chassid. Now, we don't have that much time, but the next paragraph is very critical. Let's see, we'll give it 5 minutes and see if we can at least lay the groundwork for tomorrow's analysis. Ein machsheves pigul poselas elam kein chishev lechol kezayis chutzos mano o chutzlim komo Ola hakdir kizayis chutzin zman or chutzin koma. Aval mchishev al chatzi zayis bilvad ein bo mishum pigul. Now again, this is a universal halach in pigul. It's not a specific halach in menachos, but any zevach and all kodshim require machshavas chutzin zmano on a kizayis or chutzin koma on it. Chutz lizmano on a kizayis le'achila, or chutz li mekomo on a kizayis of haktorah. So let's assume, with the exception of a carbon ola, every carbon has both the element of achila and the element of haktorah. The murim are burnt on the mizbeach. His machshav of chutz lizmano has to be on a minimum of a kizayis. Okay. Now the question is, we have machshavas pigul chutzis mano on either A, achila, or B, haktorah. Can we integrate the two? What happens if Lu Yitzuri has a machshav of chutzis mano on a half a zayis of achila and another half a zayis of haktorah? In such a case, Chishev lechol chatzi zayis ulahaktir chatzi zayis kosher. We don't integrate the two half zayis. The fee she'en shnei chatzoim mitztarf. We don't integrate two chatzi zayis into one kizayis. This is similar to halachas that we find throughout Yoredeya, machos hasuros. Let's say it's a chatzizayis of chelim and it's a chatzizayis of nevela. We don't integrate the two. Every iser and a shem iser is separate and independent, and we need a kizayis for each shem iser as a minimum to gender a chiyuv. Here too in the psul and the iser of pigul, we need a chutzis mano on one full kizayis, but not an integration of two types of achila, achilas adam, called the Kodshim, and achilas mizbeach in the case of a muru. Chatzis eyes of each of these two will not be integrated into one in order to generate a machshavas pigul. Let's just make a note of where we got up to for tomorrow. We're going to see, after mentioning this Mishnah on Daf Yud Beis in Menachos, we're going to see a discussion here in the middle of the paragraph Machshavas about someone who had a machshava on Haktorah b'lashon achil. Okay then? So that's what we accomplished, Baruch Hashem, today. And now we'll go on to Masech Yoma. I'll just do